Good evening, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Tonight, I'll be reading the last of Arthur Schopenhauer's collected aphorisms. This section is titled, On Various Subjects. Thanks for listening. As a quick note, this video will mark, for the most part, the end of my series on Schopenhauer until I might someday do some of the longer works which will take multiple days, possibly weeks to record as they're quite long. So, I'm still looking for ideas on what series to shift towards next. You guys seem to like philosophy, so if you have any suggestions for essays, written pieces, or anything you'd like covered, please leave them in the comments below, and I will see if I can find copies of them and what the copyright status is on them. Thanks for listening. Instead of trying to show that the works of nature and of the art impulse demonstrate the wisdom of God, as the English do, one should learn from them that everything which comes about through the medium of the idea, that is to say, of the intellect, even though this intellect has advanced to the point of attaining reason, is mere bungling compared with what proceeds directly from the will as thing in itself, and is not communicated through an idea, of which the works of nature are an instance. This is the theme of my essay on the will in nature. Among people untrained in philosophy, which includes all who have not studied the philosophy of Kant, that is to say, most foreigners, and no less among many present-day physicians, etc., in Germany, who are content to philosophize on the basis of their catechism, there still exists the old, fundamentally false antithesis between mind and matter. From this false antithesis there arise spiritualists and materialists. The latter assert that matter, through its form and composition, produces everything, consequently produces thought and will in man, which view the former cry out against. In reality, however, although there are certainly many nonsensical ideas and chimeras, there is neither mind nor matter in the world. The exertion of weight in a stone is every bit as inexplicable as is thought in a human brain. This fact would suggest the presence of a mind in the stone. For this reason, I would say to these disputants, you believe that you perceive dead, i.e., completely passive material void of all qualities, because you suppose you can truly understand everything which you are able to trace back to a mechanistic effect. But as physical and chemical effects are avowedly incomprehensible to you, so long as you cannot trace them back to mechanistic effects, so are these mechanistic effects themselves, that is to say, modes of expression proceeding from weight, impenetrability, cohesion, hardness, inflexibility, elasticity, fluidity, etc., just as mysterious as these others, indeed as mysterious as thought in the human head. If matter can, you know not why, fall to earth, so it can, you know not why, think. What is really comprehensible through and through in mechanics extends no further in any account of an effect than what is purely mathematical. It is limited, that is to say, to determining its spatial and temporal qualities. Both of these, however, together with all the laws which govern them, are known to us a priori, and are consequently no more than the forms of our knowledge, and belong exclusively to the realm of ideas. What determines them is thus at bottom subjective. It does not involve the purely objective, that which is independent of our knowledge of it, the thing in itself. Even in mechanics, as soon as we go beyond what is purely mathematical, as soon as we arrive at impenetrability, at weight, at inflexibility, or fluidity, or gasity, we stand before modes of expression which are just as mysterious to us as thought and will of man. That is to say, before the directly unfathomable. For unfathomable is what every natural force is. But where now is matter, which you know and understand so intimately that you intend to explain everything by it, trace everything back to it? Now, if you suppose the existence of a mind in the human head as a deus ex machina, then, as already remarked, you are bound to concede a mind to every stone. If, on the other hand, your dead and purely passive matter can, as weight, exert itself, or as electricity attract, repel, and give off sparks, then it can also, as grey matter, think. In short, all ostensible mind can be attributed to matter, but all matter can likewise be attributed to mind, from which it follows that the antithesis is a false one. No science impresses the masses more than astronomy. The almost idolatrous veneration in which Newton is held, especially in England, passes belief. Only a little while ago, the Times called him the greatest of human beings, and in 1815, according to a report in the Examiner, one of Newton's teeth was sold for £750 sterling to a lord who had it mounted on a ring. Now, this ludicrous degree of veneration accorded the great master of arithmetic comes from the fact that people take as the measure of his deserts the magnitude of the masses, the laws of whose motions he determined and traced back to the natural force causing them, which last was in any case not his discovery but that of Robert Hooke. He merely confirmed it by arithmetic. For otherwise it is impossible to see why more honor should be due to him than anyone else who traces a given effect back to the expression of a certain natural force, or why Lavoisier, for example, should not be rated just as highly. To explain given phenomena as the combined action of various different natural forces, and even to discover these forces only as a result of this explanation, is on the contrary a far harder task than that which has to consider only two, and two such simply and uniformly acting forces as gravitation and inertia in unresisting space. It is on precisely this unexampled simplicity or poverty of its material that the mathematical certainty and exactitude of astronomy rests, by virtue of which it astonishes the world, by being able even to announce the existence of planets no one has ever seen. This last achievement, though it be never so greatly admired, is, regarded in the cold light of day, no more than the identical act of reasoning which is undertaken when any still invisible cause is determined from the effects it manifests, and which was performed to an even more wonderful degree by that connoisseur who knew with certainty from a single glass of wine that there must be leather in the barrel, which was denied until, when the barrel was at last empty, a key with a little strap attached to it was found at the bottom. The act of reasoning here is the same as that involved in the discovery of Neptune, and the difference lies merely in its application, that is to say, in the object to which it is addressed. It differs in its material, not at all in its form. The polemicizing against the assumption of a life force, which is now becoming fashionable, deserves to be called not so much mistaken as downright stupid, for whoever denies the life force is fundamentally denying his own existence, and may thus boast of having scaled the topmost peak of absurdity, in so far as this impudent nonsense proceeds from physicians and chemists. However, it also involves the basest ingratitude, for the life force is what overcomes sickness and produces the cures for which these gentlemen subsequently pocket the money. If there exists no natural force whose essential property is just as much to act purposefully as it is the essential property of gravity to keep physical bodies together, which moves, directs, and orders the entire complex workings of the organism, and which expresses itself in the same way as gravity expresses itself in the phenomenon of falling, then life is only a semblance, an illusion, and every creature is in reality a mere automaton, that is, a play of mechanical, physical, and chemical forces. Physical and chemical forces are active in the animal organism, to be sure, but that which holds them together and directs them, so that they constitute a purposive and enduring organism, is the life force. To believe that physical and chemical forces could by themselves bring about an organism is not merely mistaken, but, as already remarked, stupid. This life force is in itself will. The life force is actually identical with the will, so that what appears to the self-consciousness as will is in unconscious organic life that primum mobile, which has very fittingly been called the life force. It is from a simple analogy with this that we conclude that, The other natural forces are fundamentally identical with will. Only in these forces the will stands at a lower stage of objectivization. I say, in my principal work, the genitals are, far more than any other external member of the body, subject entirely to the will and not at all to knowledge. Indeed, the will shows itself almost as independent of knowledge here as it does in those parts which, responding merely to stimuli, serve to propagate vegetative life. In fact, ideas do not act on the genitals in the form of motivation, as they do on the will in every other case, but because the erection is a reflex action, merely in the form of stimulus, and therefore directly and only so long as they are present. Another requirement, if they are to be efficacious, is that they must be present for a certain length of time, whereas an idea which acts in the form of motivation often does so in the very briefest time, and its efficacy has in general no relation to the duration of its presence. Further, the effect which an idea has on the genitals cannot, like that of a motivation, be annulled by another idea, except in so far as the second idea suppresses consciousness of the first, so that the first is no longer present, but in that event the effect is unfailingly annulled, even when the second idea contains nothing contrary to the first, which is what is required of a counter-motivation. It is accordingly not sufficient for the accomplishment of coitus that the presence of a woman should act on the man in the form of a motivation, the production of children, for example, or the performance of duty. However powerful this motivation may be in itself, her presence must act in the form of direct stimulus. I very much hold to the view that acute illnesses are, with a few exceptions, nothing other than curative processes instituted by nature itself to remedy some disorder in the organism, to which end the vis naturae medicatrix, invested with dictatorial powers, has recourse to extraordinary measures, and these constitute the illness that we feel. The simplest type of this general procedure is provided by the common cold. When we get cold, the activity of the outer skin is paralyzed, and excretion by exhalation is thereby prevented, which could lead to our death. But when this happens, the inner skin, the mucous membrane, takes over the task of the outer, and this constitutes a common cold, an illness yet clearly no more than a process for curing the actual but not perceptible illness, the cessation of the functioning of the skin. This illness, the common cold, then passes through the same stages as the primary illness: onset, intensification, climax, and decline. At first acute, it gradually grows chronic, and remains in this state until the fundamental but not perceptible trouble, the paralysis of the skin function, is over. It is therefore mortally dangerous to suppress a cold. An identical procedure constitutes the essence of almost all illnesses, and these are, in reality, only the medicine of the vis naturae medicatrix. My chief objection to pantheism is that it signifies nothing. To call the world God is not to explain it, but merely to enrich the language with a superfluous synonym for the word world. It comes to the same thing whether you say the world is God or the world is the world. If you started from God as that which is given and to be explained, and said God is the world, then, to be sure, you would be offering some kind of explanation, inasmuch as you would trace ignotus back to notius, but still no more than an explanation of a word. But if you start from what actually is given, the world, and say the world is God, then it is as plain as day that this says nothing, or, at the most, explains ignotium per ignotius. It follows that pantheism presupposes the pre-existence of theism, for only by starting from a god, that is to say, by already having one and being familiar with him, can you finally come to identify him with the world, actually in order politely to set him aside. You do not start unprejudiced from the world as that which is to be explained. You start from God as that which is given, but soon, not knowing what to do with him, you let the world take over his role. That is the origin of pantheism, for it would never occur to anyone, taking an unprejudiced view of the world, to regard it as a god. It would clearly have to be a very ill-advised god who knew of nothing better to do than to transform himself into a world such as this one. The great advantage which pantheism is supposed to represent over theism is, if taken seriously and not as a mere disguised negation, a transition from the unproved and hardly conceivable to the downright absurd. For however obscure, vague, and confused the concept may be which is attached to the word God, two predicates are nonetheless inseparable from it, supreme power and supreme wisdom. But that a being equipped with these should have transplanted himself into a situation such as this world represents, frankly, an absurd idea. For our situation in the world is obviously one into which no intelligent, not to speak of all-wise being, would transplant himself. In the first broad outlines of the Greek system of gods, one can glimpse an allegorical representation of the highest ontological and cosmological principles. Uranus is space, the first condition for all existence, thus the first begetter. Cronus is time. He castrates the procreative principle. Time annihilates all generative power, or more precisely, the capacity for generating new forms. The primary generation of living races ends after the first world period. Zeus, who is rescued from the voraciousness of his father, is matter. It alone escapes the power of time, which destroys everything else. It persists. From matter, however, all other things proceed. Zeus is the father of gods and men. The continuity, indeed the unity, of human with animal and all other nature, thus that of the microcosmos with the macrocosmos, is expressed by the mysterious, enigmatic Sphinx, by the centaurs, by the Ephesian Artemis with diverse animal forms, disposed beneath her countless breasts, as it is by the Egyptian human bodies with animal heads, and the Indian Gawessa, and finally by the Ninevite bulls and lions with human heads, which recall the avatar as man-lion. The sons of Iapetus represent four basic qualities of the human character, together with the suffering which comes from them. Atlas, the patient, has to bear and endure. Menetius, the brave, is overpowered and hurled to destruction. Prometheus, the wise and prudent, is bound, that is, his effectiveness is limited, and a vulture, i.e. care, gnaws at his heart. Epimetheus, the rash and thoughtless, is punished by his own folly. I have always found the legend of Pandora incomprehensible, indeed preposterous and absurd. I suspect that Hesiod himself already misunderstood it, and distorted its meaning. It is not all the evil, but all the good things of the world which Pandora had in her box, as her name already indicates. When Epimetheus rashly opened it, the good things flew out and away. Hope alone was saved, and still remains with us. It is not without meaning that mythology depicts Cronus as devouring and digesting stones, for that which is otherwise quite indigestible, all affliction, vexation, loss, grief, time alone digests. The downfall of the Titans, whom Zeus hurls into the underworld, seems to be the same story as the downfall of the angels who rebelled against Jehovah. The story of Idomeneus, who sacrificed his son ex voto, and that of Jephthah, is essentially the same. Can it be that, as the root of the Gothic and the Greek languages lies in Sanskrit, so there is an older mythology from which the Greek and the Jewish mythologies derive? If you cared to give scope to your imagination, you could even adduce that the twofold long night in which Zeus begot Heracles on Alcmene came about because further east Joshua at Jericho told the sun to stand still. Zeus and Jehovah were thus assisting one another, for the gods of heaven are, like those of earth, always secretly in alliance. But how innocent was the pastime of Father Zeus, compared with the bloodthirsty activities of Jehovah and his chosen brigands. Viewed from the summit of my philosophy, which, as is well known, is the standpoint of asceticism, the affirmation of the will to live is concentrated in the act of procreation, and this is its most resolute expression. Now, the meaning of this affirmation is intrinsically this, that the will, which is originally without knowledge and thus a blind impulse, arrives at knowledge of its own nature through the world as idea, but does not allow itself to be distracted or checked in its desire and passion by this knowledge. It henceforth desires consciously, and with full awareness, that which it formerly desired as a knowledgeless drive and impulse. In accordance with this, we find that he who ascetically denies life through voluntary chastity differs empirically from him who affirms life through acts of procreation, in that what takes place without knowledge as a blind physiological function, namely in sleep, in the case of the former, in the case of the latter is carried out with conscious awareness, and thus takes place in the light of knowledge. Now, it is in fact very remarkable that this abstract philosophical dictum, which is by no means allied to the spirit of the Greeks, should, together with the empirical events which confirm it, possess an exact allegorical representation in the beautiful legend of Psyche, who was permitted to enjoy Amor only if she did not see him, but who, ignoring every warning, nonetheless insisted on seeing him, whereupon, in accordance with the ineluctable decree of mysterious powers, she was plunged into limitless misery, which she could emerge from only after a sojourn in the underworld and the performance of heavy tasks there. History, which I like to think of as the antithesis of poetry, is in relation to time what geography is in relation to space. The former is, no more than the latter, a science in the true sense of the term. They both have for their subject matter not universal truths, but only individual things. History has always been a favorite study of those who want to learn something without being put to the effort demanded by the true sciences, which require the exercise of reason. But in our own time it is more popular than ever before, as is demonstrated by the countless history books which appear every year. Since I cannot avoid seeing in all history nothing but a repetition of the same things, as when a kaleidoscope is turned you see only the same things in differing configurations, I cannot share this passionate interest, though I do not go on to censure it. My only objection is that many want to make history a department of philosophy, indeed to identify it with philosophy, in that they believe it can be substituted for it, and this is ludicrous and absurd. An illustration of the preference which the general public has always had for history is provided by social conversation, as usually conducted. It consists in a rule as this, that one person narrates something, and then another person narrates something else, under which condition everyone is certain of his share of attention. As here, so in history, we see the mind occupied with quite individual things for their own sake. On the other hand, history might be regarded as a continuation of zoology, inasmuch as, while in the case of the animals it is sufficient to consider the species, in the case of man, who has individual character, we have to familiarize ourselves with individuals too, together with the individual events which condition them. The essential incompleteness of history is a direct consequence of this fact, because individuals and events are innumerable and without end. With the study of history, what you have learned in no way reduces the sum of what you have still to learn. With all true sciences, a complete knowledge is at any rate conceivable. When the history of China and India stand open to us, the endlessness of the material thus revealed will make plain the absurdity of this course, and will compel those who are avid for this kind of knowledge to see that you have to recognize the many in the one, the rule in the individual case, the ways of nations in the knowledge of human actions, but not to reckon up facts ad infinitum. To the essential incompleteness of history referred to above must be added the fact that Clio, The muse of history is as thoroughly infected with lies as a streetwalker is with syphilis. It is my belief that the events and characters narrated by history compare with reality more or less as the portraits of authors on frontispieces of books usually compare with the authors themselves. That is to say, they do so only in outline, so that they bear only a faint similarity to them, or sometimes none at all. Newspapers are the second hand of history, i.e., the hand indicating seconds on a clock. This hand, however, is usually not only of inferior metal to the other two hands, it also seldom works properly. The so-called leading articles in them are the chorus to the drama of current events. Exaggeration, in every sense, is as essential to newspaper writing as it is to the writing of plays, for the point is to make as much as possible of every occurrence, so that all newspaper writers are, for the sake of their trade, alarmists. This is their way of making themselves interesting. What they really do, however, is resemble little dogs who, as soon as anything whatever moves, start up a loud barking. It is necessary, therefore, not to pay too much attention to their alarms, and to realize in general that the newspaper is a magnifying glass, and this only at best, for very often it is no more than a shadow play on the wall. As every man possesses a physiognomy by which you can provisionally judge him, so every age also produces one that is no less characteristic, for the zeitgeist of every age is like a sharp east wind which blows through everything. You can find traces of it in all that is done, thought, and written, in music and painting, in the flourishing of this or that art. It leaves its mark on everything and every one, so that, for example, an age of phrases without meaning must also be one of music without melody, and form without aim or object. Thus the spirit of an age also bestows on it its outward physiognomy. The ground bass to this is always played by architecture. Its pattern is followed first of all by ornaments, vessels, furniture, and utensils of all kinds, and finally even by clothes, together with the manner in which the hair and beard are cut. To estimate a genius, you should not take the mistakes in his productions or his weaker works, but only in those works in which he excels. For even in the realm of the intellect, weakness and absurdity cleave so firmly to human nature that even the most brilliant mind is not always entirely free of them. Whence the mighty errors which can be pointed to, even in the works of the greatest men, and hence Horace's, sometimes even good Homer, nods off. What distinguishes genius, on the other hand, and provides a measure for estimating it, is the height to which it was able to rise when time and mood were propitious, and which remains forever unachievable to ordinary talent. The great misfortune for intellectual merit is that it has to wait until the good is praised by those who produce only the bad. Indeed, the misfortune already lies in the general fact that it has to receive its crown from the hands of human judgment, a quality of which most people possess about as much as a castrate possesses the power to beget children. Power of discrimination, and consequently judgment, that is what is lacking. They do not know how to distinguish the genuine from the spurious, the wheat from the chaff, gold from tin, and they do not perceive the great distance which separates the commonplace herd from the very rarest. The result is the state of things expressed by the ancient couplet, "It is the fate of the great here on earth, to be recognized by us only when they are no more." This lamentable lack of the power to discriminate is no less evident in the sciences, namely in the tenacious life of false and refuted theories. Once come into general credit, they continue to defy truth for centuries. After 100 years Copernicus had not yet supplanted Ptolemy. Bacon, Descartes, Locke prevailed very slowly and very late. It was no difference with Newton. You have only to see the animosity and mockery with which Leibniz opposed the Newtonian gravitational system in his controversy with Clarke. Although Newton lived for almost 40 years after the appearance of his Principia, his theory was, when he died, recognized only in England, and there only partially, while abroad he could, according to the preface to Voltaire's account of his theory, count fewer than 20 adherents. On the other hand, in our own day, Newton's absurd theory of colors still holds the field, 40 years after the appearance of Goethe's. Hume, although he started publishing very early and wrote in a thoroughly popular style, was disregarded until his 50th year. Kant, although he wrote and taught his whole life long, became famous only after his 60th year. Artists and poets have a better chance than thinkers, to be sure, because their public is at least 100 times bigger. And yet, what did Mozart and Beethoven count for during their lifetime, or Dante, or even Shakespeare? If the contemporaries of this last have had any idea of his worth, that blossoming time of painting would have given us at any rate one good, well-attested portrait of him, whereas all we have are a number of altogether doubtful paintings, a very bad engraving, and an even worse funeral monument bust. We would likewise possess hundreds of his manuscripts instead of merely a couple of legal signatures. Every Portuguese is proud of Camões, the only Portuguese poet, but he lived on alms procured for him in the streets every evening by a Negro boy he had brought back from India. As the sun needs an eye in order to shine, and music an ear in order to sound, so the worth of every masterpiece in art and science is conditioned by the mind related and equal to it to which it speaks. Only such a mind possesses the incantation to arouse the spirits imprisoned in such a work, and make them show themselves. The commonplace head stands before it as before a magic casket he cannot open, or before an instrument he cannot play, and from which he can therefore summon only inchoate noises, however much he would like to deceive himself in the matter. A beautiful work requires a sensitive mind, a speculative work a thinking mind, in order to really exist and to live. Great minds are related to the brief span of time during which they live, as great buildings are to a little square in which they stand. You cannot see them in all their magnitude because you are standing too close to them. When you see the many and manifold institutions for teaching and learning, and the great crowd of pupils and masters which throngs them, you might think that the human race was much occupied with wisdom and insight. But here, too, appearance is deceptive. The latter teach to earn money, and strive not for wisdom, but for the appearance of it, and to be credited with it. The former learn not to achieve knowledge and insight, but so as to be able to chatter about them, and give themselves airs. Every 30 years a new generation appears which knows nothing, and then sets about trying to gulp down summarily and as fast as possible all the human knowledge assembled over the millennia, after which it would like to think that it knows more than all the past put together. To this end it resorts to universities and reaches out for books, and for the most recent ones too, as being its own contemporaries and fellows of its own age. Everything quick and everything new as it is itself, and then off it goes, loud with its own opinions. Students and learned men of every kind and every age go as a rule in search of information, not insight. They make it a point of honor to have information about everything. It does not occur to them that information is merely a means towards insight, and possesses little or no value in itself. When I see how much these well-informed people know, I sometimes say to myself, "Oh, how little such a one must have had to think about, since he has had so much time for reading." The completest erudition compares with genius as a herbarium compares with the ever self-renewing, ever fresh, ever youthful, ever-changing plant world, and there is no greater contrast than that between the erudition of the commentator and the childlike naivete of the ancient author. Dilettantes, dilettantes! This is the derogatory cry of those who apply themselves to art or science for the sake of gain, raise against those who pursue it for love of it and pleasure in it. This derogation rests on their vulgar conviction that no one would take up a thing seriously unless prompted to it by want, hunger, or some other kind of greediness. The public has the same outlook, and consequently holds the same opinion, which is the origin of its universal respect for the professional, and its mistrust of the dilettante. The truth, however, is that to the dilettante, the thing is the end, while to the professional as such it is the means, and only he who is directly interested in a thing, and occupies himself with it from love of it, will pursue it with entire seriousness. It is from such as these, and not from wage-earners, that the greatest things have always come. The abolition of Latin as the universal learned language, and the introduction in its place of the parochialism of national literatures, has been a real misfortune for science and learning in Europe. In the first place, because it was only through the medium of the Latin language that a universal European learned public existed at all, to the totality of which every book that appeared directed itself. And, in all Europe, the number of heads capable of thinking and forming judgments is, moreover, already so small, that if their forum is broken up and kept asunder by language barriers, their beneficial effect is infinitely weakened. To this great disadvantage, however, a second, even worse one will soon be added. The classical languages will soon cease to be taught. Neglect of them is already getting the upper hand in France and even in Germany. That as early as the 1830s the Corpus Juris was translated into German was an unmistakable sign that ignorance of the basis of all learning, the Latin language, had entered upon the scene. That is to say, barbarism had entered upon the scene. It has now got to the point at which Greek and even Latin authors are published in editions with German notes, which is beastliness and an infamy. The real reason, whatever the gentleman may say, is that the editors no longer know how to write Latin, and our dear young people are only too glad to follow them along the path of laziness, ignorance, and barbarism. A vile practice appearing with more impudent blatantness every day, which deserves special reproof, is that in scholarly books and in specifically learned journals, even those published by academies, passages from Greek, and even, pro pudor, from Latin authors are cited in German translation. Devil take it! Are you writing for tailors and cobblers? If this is what it has come to, then farewell humanity, noble taste, and cultivation. Barbarism is returning, despite railways, electricity, and flying balloons. We are finally losing another advantage enjoyed by all of our forefathers. It is not only Roman antiquity which Latin preserves for us, it is equally the entire Middle Ages of every European land, and modern times down to the middle of the last century. Scotus Erigena from the 9th century, John of Salisbury from the 12th, Raymond Lully from the 13th, together with 100 others, speak to me directly in the language natural and proper to them as soon as they begin thinking on scholarly subjects. They still approach close up to me. I am in direct contact with them and learn to know them truly. What would it be if each had written in the language of his own country as it was in his time? I wouldn't understand as much as half of it, and real intellectual contact with them would be impossible. I would see them as silhouettes on the distant horizon, or, worse, through the telescope of a translation. It was to guard against this that Bacon, as he expressly says, himself translated his own essays into Latin, under the title Sermones Fideles, in which, however, he had the assistance of Hobbes. It should here be remarked, in passing, that patriotism, when it wants to make itself felt in the domain of learning, is a dirty fellow who should be thrown out of doors. For what could be more impertinent than, where the purely and universally human is the only concern, and where truth, clarity, and beauty should alone be of any account, to presume to put into the scales one's preference for the country to which one's own valued person happens to belong, and then, with that in view, do violence to truth and commit injustice against the great minds of other nations, in order to puff up the lesser minds of one's own. In accordance with the nature of our intellect, concepts ought to arise through abstraction from our perceptions. Consequently, perception should precede concept. If this has in fact happened, as it has in the case of the man whose own experience is his only book and teacher, then he knows quite well what perceptions belong to which of his concepts, and are represented by them. We may call this natural education, In the case of artificial education, on the contrary, the head is, through lectures, teaching, and reading, stuffed full of concepts before there is any wide acquaintanceship with the perceptual world at all. Experience is then supposed to supply the perceptions to fit these concepts. Up to that time, however, they have been wrongly applied, and things and men, consequently, wrongly judged, wrongly seen, wrongly dealt with. So it happens that education produces wrong-headedness, and that is why, in youth, after much reading and learning, we go out into the world in part naive, in part confused, and conduct ourselves in it now with arrogance, now with timidity. Our heads are full of concepts which we are now endeavoring to apply, but which we almost always apply wrongly. In accordance with the foregoing, the chief factor in education would be that acquaintanceship with the world, the achievement of which we may designate the object of all education, should begin from the right end. This, however, depends, as has been shown, on perception always preceding concept, and further on the narrower concept preceding the wider, and the entire course of instruction thus proceeding in the order in which concepts presuppose one another. As soon, however, as something in this series is overleaped, there arise defective concepts, and from these false concepts, and finally a wrong-headed view of the world, of which almost everyone carries his own version around in his head, some for a long time, most forever. Correct understanding of many, quite simple things comes only when one is advanced in years, and sometimes it then comes suddenly. There has been, as it were, a blind spot in one's acquaintanceship with the world, originating in an overleaping of the subject in one's early education, whether this education was an artificial one or a natural one, through one's own experience. Because errors imbibed early are mostly ineradicable, and because the reasoning faculty is the last to mature, children should not, until they are 16, be exposed to any subject in which major errors are possible, that is to say, philosophy, religion, and general views of all kinds. They should be introduced only to those in which error is either impossible, as in mathematics, or of no great moment, as in languages, natural science, history, etc. In general, however, only to such studies as are accessible to their age and completely comprehensible. Childhood and youth is the time for assembling data and for becoming specifically and thoroughly acquainted with individual things. Reasoning and judgment in general must remain in suspense, and ultimate explanations be deferred. Since the reasoning faculty presupposes maturity and experience, it should be let alone for the time being. The impression of prejudices upon it, before it is mature, will damage it for good. Maturity of knowledge, that is, the degree of perfection to which knowledge can attain in each individual, consists in this, that in every case an exact correspondence has been achieved between abstract concept and perceptual comprehension, so that every concept rests directly or indirectly on a perceptual basis, through which alone it possesses real value, and that every perception can likewise be subsumed under the concept appropriate to it. Maturity is solely the work of experience, and consequently of time. For, since we usually acquire our perceptual and our abstract knowledge separately, the former by natural means, the latter through good or bad instruction and communication from others, there is in youth usually little correspondence between our concepts, which have been fixed by mere words, and the real knowledge we have acquired through perception. These approach one another only gradually, and mutually correct one another, but only when they are entirely united is our knowledge mature. The animal voice serves only to express excitement and agitation of the will. The human, however, serves also to express knowledge. This is consistent with the fact that the former almost always make an unpleasant impression on us, the voices of a few birds alone exempted. When human language began to evolve, the beginning was certainly made by interjections, which express not concepts but, like the sounds made by animals, feelings, agitations of the will. The differences between them soon made themselves felt, and out of this difference there arose the transition to substantives, verbs, personal pronouns, etc. The word of man is the most durable of all material. Once a poet has embodied his fleeting sensations in words appropriate to them, they live on in those words through the millennia, and stir anew in every perceptive reader. That the outer mirrors the inner, and that the countenance expresses and reveals the whole essence of a man, is a presupposition whose a priority and consequent certainty is manifested in the universal desire to see any man who has made himself prominent in any way, whether for good deeds or bad, or who has produced some extraordinary work, or, if this proves impossible, to learn from others what he looks like. Likewise, in everyday life, everyone inspects the face of anyone he meets, and silently tries to discover in advance from his physiognomy his moral and intellectual nature. None of this would be so if, as some fools believe, a man's appearance possessed no significance, and the body bore no closer relation to the soul than the coat does to the body. The contrary is the case. Every human face is a hieroglyph which can be deciphered, indeed whose key we bear ready-made within us. It is even true that a man's face, as a rule, says more, and more interesting things than his mouth, for it is a compendium of everything his mouth will ever say, in that it is the monogram of all this man's thoughts and aspirations. The mouth, further, expresses only the thoughts of a man, while the face expresses a thought of nature, so that everyone is worth looking at, even if everyone is not worth talking to. We all proceed on the basis of the unspoken rule that every man is as he looks. This is a correct rule. The difficulty lies in applying it. The capacity for doing so is in part inborn, in part to be gained through experience, but no one ever perfects it. Even the most practiced detect errors in themselves. Yet the face does not lie. It is we who read what is not written there. In any event, the deciphering of the face is a great and difficult art. Its principles can never be learned in abstracto. The first precondition for practicing it is that you must take a purely objective view of your man, which is not so easy to do. For as soon as the slightest trace of aversion, or partiality, or fear, or hope, or even the thought of what impression we ourselves are making on him, in short, as soon as anything subjective is involved, the hieroglyph becomes confused and corrupted. Just as we can hear the sound of a language only if we do not understand it, because otherwise what is signified at once suppresses consciousness of the sign which signifies it, so we can see the physiognomy of a man only if he is a stranger to us. Consequently, one can, strictly speaking, receive a purely objective impression of a face, and thus have the possibility of deciphering it only at first sight. Let us not dissemble over the fact that this first sight is usually extremely disagreeable. With the exception of the beautiful, good-natured, or intelligent faces, with the exception, that is, of a very few rare faces, I believe that every new face will usually arouse in a person of finer feeling a sensation akin to terror, since it presents the disagreeable in a new and surprising combination. As a rule, it is in truth a sorry sight. There are even some upon whose face there is imprinted such naive vulgarity and lowness of character combined with such beast-like narrowness of mind that one wonders why they go around with such a face, and do not rather wear a mask. Indeed, there are faces at the mere sight of which one feels polluted. The metaphysical explanation of this fact would involve the consideration that the individuality of each man is precisely that of which, through his existence itself, he is to be cured. If, on the other hand, you are content with the psychological explanation, you should ask yourself what kind of physiognomy is to be expected of those in whom the course of a long life there has very rarely arisen anything but petty, base, miserable thoughts, and common, selfish, base, and mischievous desires. Each of them, while it was present, set its mark on his face, and by much repetition deeply engraved itself there. Kant wrote an essay on the vital powers. I should prefer to write a dirge and threnody on them, because their continual employment in banging and hammering and general noise-making has been a daily torment to me all my life. There are people I know, indeed very many of them, who smile at these things, because they are insensitive to noise. But these are the same people who are insensitive to argument, to ideas, to poetry, and works of art, in short, to intellectual impressions of every kind, the reason being the tough constitution and firm texture of their brain. On the other hand, I have discovered complaints about the torment noise causes thinking men, in the biographies or other personal statements of almost all the great writers. For example, in Kant's, in Goethe's, in Lichtenberg's, in Jean Paul's. Indeed, if such a complaint is missing, it is merely because the context failed to provide an opportunity for it. I explain the matter as follows. As when a large diamond is broken into pieces, its value is equal to only so many little diamonds. Or when an army is reduced to small units, it becomes ineffective. So, when a great mind is interrupted, disturbed, and distracted, it is capable of no more than a commonplace mind, because its superiority consists in concentrating all its forces on one single point and object, in the same way as a concave mirror concentrates all its rays. And this is precisely what noisy interruption prevents it from doing. That is why eminent minds have always been so extremely adverse to every kind of disturbance, interruption, and distraction, and most of all to violent interruption by noise, while the rest are not especially troubled by it. The most sensible and intelligent of all European nations has even called the rule, "Never interrupt," the 11th commandment. Noise, however, is the most impertinent of all interruptions, since it interrupts, indeed disrupts, even our thoughts. Where there is nothing to interrupt, to be sure, it will cause no especial discomfiture. 2 Chinamen, visiting Europe, went to the theatre for the first time. One of them occupied himself with trying to understand the theatrical machinery, which he succeeded in doing. The other, despite his ignorance of the language, sought to unravel the meaning of the play. The former is like the astronomer, the latter the philosopher. No rose without a thorn, but many a thorn without a rose. The dog is rightly the symbol of loyalty. In the plant world, however, it should be the fir tree, for it alone abides with us through bad times as well as good. It does not desert us when the sun does, like all other trees, plants, birds, and insects, to return only when the sky above us is blue again. A mother had, for their education and betterment, given her children Aesop's fables to read. Very soon, however, they brought the book back to her, and the eldest, who was very knowing and precocious, said, "This is not a book for us. It's much too childish and silly. We've got past believing that foxes, wolves, and ravens can talk. We're far too grown up for such nonsense." Who cannot see in this hopeful lad the future enlightened rationalist?